we simply cannot have this conversation without talking about the fact that, as Ranking Member Schatz just mentioned, earlier this year, the Trump administration abruptly cut off funding to help track the victims of Russian kidnapping and deliver justice. And as noted already, that data was almost all lost and delayed in being sent to the proper authorities. That was absolutely senseless. And today there is still no ongoing U.S. funding for this specific work. Now, I wish that we had the Trump administration officials here with us today to explain why that program was terminated and to talk about efforts in this space moving forward. I understand, Mr. Chairman, they were invited, but they're not here today, and that really is inexplicable to me. We have also seen the Trump administration put forward drafts of so-called peace plans that read more like Russian wish lists.
Did you hear what you just heard? Because I need you to understand what you just heard before we even begin to unpack the cascading layers of moral catastrophe embedded in those 90 seconds of testimony from Senator Patty Murray. And let me tell you something right now. This is not one of those stories where we get to pretend both sides have a point, or where we engage in the performative neutrality that has poisoned American political discourse for decades, because what we are witnessing here is nothing less than the deliberate sabotage of efforts to rescue thousands upon thousands of children who have been stolen. Yes, stolen. Abducted by an authoritarian regime engaged in what the International Criminal Court has already determined constitutes war crimes, and the Trump administration, the same administration that wrapped itself in the flag and claimed to be the defender of American values and strength on the world stage, has deliberately, consciously, inexplicably cut the funding that was tracking these children. And let me be crystal clear about what that means, because the Trump administration has terminated a U.S.-funded initiative that documents alleged Russian war crimes, including a sensitive database detailing the mass deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. And when Senator Murray says the data was almost all lost and delayed in being sent to proper authorities, we are talking about 30,000 confirmed children stolen from their families, 30,000 human beings, 30,000 childhoods, 30,000 futures that hang in the balance, and the people who claim to be pro-family, who claim to care about protecting the innocent, who wrap themselves in the rhetoric of moral clarity, decided that this program was expendable. Let me take you deeper into what was actually destroyed here, because this is not some abstract policy debate. This is not a line item in a budget that we can afford to be agnostic about. The program, led by Yale University's Humanitarian Research Lab, under the State Department's Conflict Observatory, collected biometric data and satellite imagery to document Russia's abduction of Ukrainian children, which means we are talking about demographic information, names, confirmation of the fact that they were stolen, where they were taken from, and then using satellite data where they are now, and when that database went dark. Researchers lost access to the database last month, after officials terminated the contract, cutting off critical evidence from investigators pursuing war crimes cases. What we lost was not just data points. We lost the only comprehensive mechanism that existed to track the locations of these children so they could actually be returned to their families. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it's the difference between showing up to a negotiation with a list of all the names and locations and not having any list at all. Those are the words of Representative Greg Landsman, and they should chill you to your core. But wait, because it gets worse. It always gets worse with this administration, and here is where the moral dimension becomes utterly inescapable. The observatory's research contributed to multiple reports on Russia's actions in Ukraine and played a role in securing 6 International Criminal Court indictments, including the 2023 arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. And let me spell this out for you, because the International Criminal Court does not issue arrest warrants for heads of state lightly. Putin is allegedly responsible for the war crime of unlawful deportation of population, specifically children, and that of unlawful transfer of population from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation, with the crimes allegedly committed in Ukrainian occupied territory, at least from 24 February 2022, which means this is not speculation, this is not propaganda, this is documented evidence of systematic child abduction that meets the legal definition of war crimes, and the Trump administration looked at the program that was gathering that evidence and said, no, we are done here, cut the funding, let the data disappear into the ether. And I need you to understand the scale of what Russia has been doing, because this is not a handful of cases, this is industrial-level child abduction. A report from the Yale School of Public Health's Humanitarian Research Lab concluded that Russia has kidnapped thousands of children from Ukraine to at least 210 facilities inside Russia and Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, and subjected them to re-education or militarization at many of the facilities, And when we say re-education, what we mean is the deliberate erasure of Ukrainian identity, the forced assimilation into Russian culture. Putin even signed a decree in 2022, making it easier for Russian families to adopt Ukrainian children. So we are witnessing in real time what scholars of genocide call cultural annihilation, the systematic attempt to destroy a people by stealing their children and reprogramming them to forget who they are. And Vladimir Putin has an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court specifically for this crime. And what did the Trump administration do in response? They pulled the plug on the very program that was documenting it. Now let us talk about the justification, because there always has to be some threadbare excuse for cruelty masquerading as policy. And what we got was remarkable in its inadequacy. One of the administrators said that it was part of saving money but doesn't save any money. The money had been spent, so this was not even a cost-saving measure. The funds had already been allocated and spent, meaning the decision to terminate the program was purely ideological, or purely performative, or purely something even more sinister. Representative Landsman said he doesn't think there's an American Republican, Democrat, Independent who would want to see us give up on these children. And yet here we are. The administration gave up on them anyway. And when Senator Murray called out Trump officials for ducking the congressional hearing, where they could have explained themselves, where they could have justified this unconscionable decision, they simply did not show up. They were invited, and they refused to appear, which tells you everything you need to know about whether they believe they can defend this choice in front of the American people. But I want to zoom out for a moment because what makes this story absolutely explosive is not just the humanitarian catastrophe of abandoned children, though that alone should be enough to spark national outrage. It is the pattern of behavior it reveals about Trump's relationship with Russia, and Senator Murray did not mince words when she said that the Trump administration put forward drafts of so-called peace plans that read more like Russian wish lists than a serious plan, and she is not exaggerating because Trump's 28-point peace plan would force Kyiv to give up additional territory in the east, agree it will never join NATO and accept full amnesty for Russians accused of war crimes. So let me connect these dots for you, in case they were not already blazing with neon clarity. The Trump administration cut funding for the program documenting Russian war crimes against children at the exact same time they were drafting a peace plan that includes full amnesty for Russians accused of war crimes, which means they were actively undermining accountability for crimes against children while simultaneously negotiating away any consequences for the perpetrators of those crimes. Do you see the architecture of complicity here? Because this is not incompetence, this is not bureaucratic bungling, this is policy alignment with Russian interests. And when the administration acquiesced to a Kremlin demand that Trump's Ukraine-Russia envoy, former Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, be excluded from the peace talks in Saudi Arabia, on the grounds that Kellogg is too supportive of Ukraine, what we are watching is an American administration allowing Vladimir Putin to dictate the terms of American diplomacy. Russian media figures could not have engineered a more pro-Russian president than Donald Trump. Those words come from MSNBC analysis, and they capture precisely the horror of what we are witnessing, which is an American president who acts not as a defender of democratic values or human rights or basic moral decency, but as a facilitator of Russian strategic objectives. And I want to linger on the peace plan for just a moment longer, because the details are so appalling they deserve extended examination. The draft plan would have Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States, marking a stunning reversal of long-standing U.S. policy to acknowledge Ukraine's territorial integrity. The plan calls for Ukrainian forces to withdraw from the parts of Donetsk that they currently control, and this withdrawal zone will be considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation. Which means Trump is not proposing a peace plan. He is proposing a surrender document that rewards Russian aggression by giving Putin everything he wanted when he launched this illegal invasion, and buried in that 28-point framework is the full amnesty provision, which would mean that all the Russian officials who orchestrated the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, all the military commanders who bombed hospitals and schools, all the soldiers who committed atrocities in Bucha and Mariupol, would face zero consequences, and Trump wants Ukraine to agree to this, and when they understandably resist, his administration cuts the funding for the programs that document why such amnesty would be unconscionable. Let me bring this back to the children, because in all the geopolitical maneuvering we cannot lose sight of the human beings at the center of this nightmare. Children have been rescued from Russian foster families, rescued from Russian military academies, even from the Russian army, and they testify how they have been forcibly taken to the Russian army, with thousands of Ukrainian children in such risk, many of them forcibly conscripted, and now fighting against their own people, because if not, they will be jailed or killed. These are the words of Mykola Kuleba, from Save Ukraine, testifying before the Senate. So we are talking about children who have been stolen from their homes, placed in Russian military schools, and then forced at gunpoint to fight against Ukraine, to fight against their own country, to potentially kill their own neighbors, and if they refuse, they face prison or execution. This is the machinery of atrocity that the Trump administration decided was not worth funding the documentation of. This is the reality they chose to look away from. And I need to emphasize something that might get lost in the enormity of these numbers. Every single one of these children is an individual human story. The report includes stories like that of the girl called by the pseudonym Lyubov, who said she only learned that she had been permanently placed in a Russian household after her arrival in their home. She had thought that she would be returned to Ukraine after she temporarily stayed with citizens of Russia, and was shocked to find out that she would be living with them permanently. Imagine being that child. Imagine being told you are going on a temporary visit, and then discovering you have been sold or given away or stolen into permanent placement in a foreign country. Imagine the psychological violence of that betrayal. Imagine your parents back in Ukraine frantically searching for you with no way to know where you are. And now imagine that the most powerful country in the world, the nation that likes to lecture the rest of the planet about freedom and democracy, decided that tracking your location and facilitating your return was not a priority. Representative Landsman was disappointed that child abductions haven't been front and center in peace talks, noting that if somebody stole one American child, we would want that to be top of mind, and at the top of the list, and it probably would be. Yet we're talking about 30,000 confirmed children stolen from their families, and this is the fundamental hypocrisy that I want to burn into your consciousness. Because if a foreign power abducted 30,000 American children, if Russia or Iran or China kidnapped tens of thousands of kids from American soil, there is not a single member of Congress who would not be screaming for military intervention. There is not a single politician who would suggest we cut funding for programs tracking those children. There would be 24-hour cable news coverage. There would be national days of mourning. There would be promises that every resource of the American government would be deployed to bring them home. And yet when it happens to Ukrainian children, when it happens to the children of our democratic ally who is fighting for survival against authoritarian aggression, the Trump administration says this is expendable. This is something we can save money on even though the money was already spent. This is something we can just quietly shut down and hope nobody notices. And she is absolutely correct, because what Trump is doing is signaling to Putin that American resolve can be waited out, that American commitment to justice is negotiable, that if Putin just holds firm long enough, Trump will give him everything he wants, including amnesty for war crimes and tacit acceptance of the kidnapping of children, and every dictator on earth is watching this and learning the lesson that American promises mean nothing. American values are hollow, and American power will not be deployed in defense of the vulnerable. And I want to talk about the larger historical context here, because what we are witnessing has very specific echoes in the annals of genocide and crimes against humanity. The forced transfer of children from one ethnic group to another, with the intent to destroy the identity of that group, is literally part of the legal definition of genocide under international law. This is not hyperbole. This is not progressive hysteria. European Parliament resolutions have declared that the systematic forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children meets the legal definition of genocide, and have called on all member states to officially recognize them as such. And the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants for Putin rest on exactly this foundation, which is that the systematic abduction and forced assimilation of Ukrainian children represents an attempt to destroy Ukrainian national identity itself. And here is what should terrify every person who believes in accountability and justice, and the international rules-based order that has prevented major power conflicts for nearly 8 decades. The Trump administration is not just ignoring this genocide, they are actively impeding efforts to document it and hold perpetrators accountable. Work on the Yale database was first halted when Trump froze all foreign aid spending by executive order, and later a State Department official named Peter Morocco, best known for his first assignment shutting down the United States Agency for International Development, ended the contract option, so we even know the name of the bureaucrat who pulled the plug, Peter Morocco. Remember that name because he is the person who decided that tens of thousands of stolen children were less important than whatever ideological axe he was grinding when he terminated the contract. The Yale lab was among several recipients, sharing in a $26 million congressionally approved 3-year expenditure aimed at tracking Russian war crimes in Ukraine, and lawmakers warned that surrender on this front will result in the total abandonment of at least 30,000 innocent children from Ukraine, which means Congress appropriated this money. Congress made the decision that this was a national priority, and unelected administration officials simply decided to ignore congressional intent and shut it down anyway. Now I want you to think about what message this sends to Ukraine itself, because as of March 17, 2025, thanks to the combined efforts of state authorities and international partners, Ukraine has successfully returned 1,243 children, which means out of tens of thousands abducted, they have managed through Herculean effort to bring home just over 1,000, and every single one of those returns required the kind of detailed intelligence and diplomatic coordination that the Yale database was facilitating. And now that infrastructure is gone, that support is terminated, those children still in Russian captivity have just had their chances of returning home slashed because the United States decided this was not important enough to continue funding. And imagine being a Ukrainian parent whose child is among the 30,000 still missing. Imagine learning that the most powerful country on earth just decided to stop helping you find your stolen child because it did not fit with their political agenda. And we cannot ignore the domestic political implications here, because what Trump is doing with Ukraine is part of a broader pattern of authoritarian alignment that should horrify anyone who believes in democracy. He spent his first term praising dictators from Putin to Kim Jong-un to Xi Jinping. He attempted to extort Ukraine by withholding military aid unless they manufactured dirt on his political opponents. He was impeached for that extortion. And now in his second term, he is sabotaging efforts to hold Russia accountable for war crimes while simultaneously proposing peace plans that read like Russian propaganda. And the through line here is unmistakable. Trump does not see authoritarians as adversaries. He sees them as role models. He admires their ability to act without constraint. He envies their freedom from accountability. And he is willing to sacrifice Ukrainian children on the altar of his bizarre personal affinity for Vladimir Putin. Let me also highlight the grotesque fiscal dishonesty at the heart of this decision, because Trump and his allies will inevitably claim this is about fiscal responsibility, about not wasting taxpayer dollars, about making hard choices in a time of budgetary constraint, but the money had already been spent, so this saved exactly $0. And even if we pretend for a moment that saving money was a legitimate concern, we are talking about a program that was part of a $26 million three-year expenditure, which in the context of the federal budget is a rounding error. It is microscopic. The United States military budget is nearly $900 billion annually. We spend more than $26 million every few hours on defense, so the claim that we needed to cut funding for tracking kidnapped children to save money is not just false, it is insulting. It is the kind of lie that insults the intelligence of anyone paying attention. And I want to draw your attention to the unconscionable cowardice of Trump administration officials refusing to appear before Congress to explain this decision. Senator Murray makes it clear that Trump officials were invited to the hearing, they were given the opportunity to defend their choice, to explain their reasoning, to make their case to the American people through their elected representatives, and they simply did not show up. They ducked the hearing, they refused to be held accountable, and that refusal tells you everything, because if they believed this was a defensible decision, they would have shown up to defend it. If they thought they could justify abandoning these children, they would have made the attempt. But they knew they could not. They knew that no explanation would suffice. They knew that sitting in front of senators and trying to explain why tracking kidnapped children was expendable would expose the moral bankruptcy of their position, so they took the coward's way out and just did not appear. What we are watching is the normalization of atrocity through bureaucratic indifference. And that normalization is one of the most dangerous processes in political life, because it is how societies become complicit in horrors they would have rejected out of hand just years earlier. You start by saying that some victims matter less than others. You move to saying that holding perpetrators accountable is too complicated, or too expensive, or too politically inconvenient. You end up at a place where war crimes against children do not even warrant the minimal investment required to document and track them. And that is where Trump has taken us. That is the moral landscape of his foreign policy, a landscape where Ukrainian children can be stolen with impunity because the leader of the free world has decided their return is not worth the effort. Senator Murray is calling this out with the moral clarity it demands. She is saying that peace plans that read like Russian wish lists are not serious plans. She is saying that we need to stand firm by our allies. She is saying that accountability and justice are not negotiable, and she is saying that kidnapping children is fundamentally immoral. And every single one of those statements should be uncontroversial. They should command universal assent, and yet in the Trump era they function as a radical challenge to administration policy because Trump's policy is appeasement of Russia. Trump's policy is abandonment of Ukraine. Trump's policy is the sacrifice of universal values in favor of transactional deals with dictators. And I need you to recognize that this is not just about Ukraine. This is about what kind of country America is going to be. This is about whether we believe our stated values, or whether those values are just rhetorical decoration we dust off when convenient and discard when they become inconvenient. Because if we cannot muster the resolve to maintain funding for a program tracking tens of thousands of kidnapped children, if we cannot maintain that minimal commitment to human rights and accountability, then what exactly do we stand for? What distinguishes us from the authoritarian regimes we claim to oppose? Why should any ally trust our promises, or any adversary fear our threats, when we demonstrate so clearly that our commitments evaporate the moment they become even slightly challenging? The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin specifically for the crime of deporting children. That is an unprecedented step that reflects the gravity of what Russia has done, and the observatory's reports identified at least 35,000 children affected by these forced transfers, with researchers insisting that their findings are crucial for Ukraine's efforts to bring them home. And Trump looked at that work and said, "We are done here. Shut it down, let the evidence disappear." And that decision will have consequences that echo for generations, because every child who could have been found with the data that was lost, every child who remains in Russian captivity because the United States pulled the plug on tracking efforts, every one of those children represents not just a personal tragedy but a moral failure of the American government. Many children who have been rescued have a draft notice for the Russian army, which is a huge risk, with kids rescued from Russian foster families, rescued from Russian military academies, even from the Russian army itself. And think about what it means that children are being placed in Russian military academies, that they are being conscripted into the Russian military, that they are being forced to fight against their own homeland. This is child soldiering in addition to child abduction. These are multiple overlapping war crimes, and the Trump administration's response was to cut funding for documenting them. I want to end by putting this in the starkest possible terms, because the stakes could not be higher, and the moral clarity could not be more urgent. Vladimir Putin ordered the systematic abduction of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. He has an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for that crime. Those children are being subjected to forced re-education designed to erase their Ukrainian identity. Many are being placed in military training programs and forced to fight against their own country. The United States had a program that was tracking these children and providing the evidence necessary to hold Russia accountable and facilitate returns, and Donald Trump shut that program down, cut the funding, let the data deteriorate, refused to send officials to explain the decision to Congress, and then put forward a peace plan that would grant amnesty to everyone responsible for these crimes. That is the story. That is what you just heard Senator Murray describing. That is the scandal that should dominate every news cycle until it is reversed. And if you are not outraged by this, then I genuinely do not know what would qualify as outrageous in your moral universe. Because if abandoning kidnapped children to score points with an authoritarian dictator is not beyond the pale, then nothing is beyond the pale. And we have officially entered a post-moral era of American foreign policy where might makes right and the vulnerable are expendable, and every single person who remains silent in the face of this atrocity, every politician who refuses to demand restoration of funding, every citizen who shrugs and moves on to the next news story, becomes complicit in what amounts to the abandonment of tens of thousands of children to their fate at the hands of a regime that has already been indicted for war crimes. Senator Murray is right to call this absolutely senseless. She is right to demand better from this administration. She is right to insist that we stand firm for basic principles like accountability and justice, especially when it comes to something as fundamentally immoral as kidnapping children. And the question now is whether the American people will stand with her, or whether we will allow this moral catastrophe to be memory-holed and forgotten, because it is too complicated, or too depressing, or too challenging to the narrative that both sides are equally flawed. This is not a both-sides story. This is a story about an American administration making a conscious choice to abandon children who have been stolen by a hostile foreign power, and if that does not move you to action, then I honestly do not know what will. But I know that history will judge us harshly for this moment, if we allow it to pass without demanding accountability and reversal.